All right, Genesis chapter 29. We continue to pick it up with a key figure, and his name is Jacob. And these are no small figures, are they? We have Abraham, we have Isaac, and now we have Jacob. And of course, this is three generations. We have Abraham, the son, or the father, then we have Isaac, his son, and then his grandson, Jacob. And these particular individuals are so key that even in the New Testament, God sometimes will identify himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so it just kind of gives us an idea of how instrumental these particular individuals are. These are no small individuals. These are key players in the plan of salvation and revealing God's will and truth to us. And so we have some good examples for us, and we also have God's plan of salvation as well. So Genesis 29, verse 1 is where we pick it up. Last week we looked at Genesis chapter 28, and Pastor Ross had brought us through that experience, that deep experience that Jacob had had. When he left, he had to leave rather hastily from his home. Now, he didn't run out the back door as soon as he heard the bad news about his brother wanting to take his life, but he had to leave fairly hastily. He kind of had his mother kind of approached her husband Isaac and said, hey, listen, we need to be able to set Isaac up with a woman that is of our people, someone that worships the true God of heaven, and not one of the daughters of Heth, not one of the local Canaanites that are idolaters. And so they kind of, there was a hasty blessing from Isaac, and Jacob kind of grabbed what he could, and he started to head north. Anybody know how far north he was heading? Anybody want to venture a guess how far north he was heading? He was going to the city of Haran. Now, of course, Haran is where Abraham had camped for some time with his dad and with the rest of his family. His dad, Nahor, had died in Haran. This was a key kind of foundational city for as far as the family, the extended family of Abraham and his descendants, Jacob, Isaac, and so on. How far was that? Yeah, that's very close. Somebody said 400 miles. Okay, so it's closer to 450 miles. So that's a fair ways to go by foot. Okay, he didn't have any camels. He had no servants and so on. For sure, Abraham's servant, when he went up to get Rebekah for Isaac, of course, he was a lot more equipped than Jacob was. So Jacob was a little bit more hasty in his departure. He started to head north. He had a long journey ahead of him. 450 miles by foot, and of course we have that classic story where he stopped and he slept the first night somewhere in the city of Zur, I think it was originally called. Maybe I'm getting the name right. No, Luz. I think it was Luz. And of course he changed the name to Bethel. And that was after he received a vision from the Lord, didn't he? And of course we find that he slept on a rock, and Pastor Shawn helped me out in that in regards to the fact that he probably wasn't sleeping with his ear right on the rock, that he probably had some kind of padding in between, and of course that makes a whole lot more sense, and I think he got a better night's sleep than I thought he did. But he was still interrupted throughout the night, wasn't he? And God gave him this powerful vision that not only renewed and confirmed to Jacob that he indeed did have the spiritual birthright, that in spite of all the finaglings that had taken place, some of the disappointments and different ways that the family had kind of approached that, we find that God is confirming that indeed the blessing that his dad had given to him was indeed divinely given. And so he confirms the Abrahamic covenant with him during that vision. And then, of course, he also had the ladder that went all the way to heaven. And then we also had the angels that were going up and down the ladder, of course, representing the presence of angels, and that angels are constantly going back and forth and ministering for our sake. As Paul wrote in Hebrews, he says that they are ministering spirits, and those ministering spirits, of course, are invisible angels, and so we refer to them as spirits, which represents air or breath, and some other words that we also translate that word into. And so we have these invisible angels that normally are invisible, but in the vision, God gives him a brief glimpse of the fact that they're going back and forth between heaven, and that there's a real battle that's going on between good and evil. And not only that, in that battle, if we find ourselves on the Lord's side, that those angels are working and ministering for us. And I don't know about you, but I find that encouraging to be able to know that we're not alone, that the Lord's with us. Yes, he's in our hearts. He's available through his Holy Spirit and such, but that he also has angels, these agents that are working on our behalf, and also protecting us from the fallen angels that are also called demons. So it also gives us some insight into the great controversy that's taking place between good and evil, and the need that we have for angels in this life. So, of course, Jacob makes a vow at the end of chapter 28, and this is just a couple of minute review. And he makes that vow, and in response to the vision and the covenant that God is confirming and offering to him, then we have the response of Jacob. He makes a vow in response and says, well, if the Lord is going to be with me and everywhere I go, he's going to provide for me and such, and give me and bring me back to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And so he confirms his faith and devotion to his God and sets up a pillar as such. So then we come to Genesis chapter 29, and Jacob continues his journey. It says in verse 1, so Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And of course, that's originally where Abraham and Jacob's family came from, wasn't it? Was from Mesopotamia, from the east. And so he's going back to his own people. Now, if there's anything, in each chapter I look at, I try to think, okay, Lord, what is one good takeaway that you want us to be able to put in our pocket and walk with in regards to our life and not just Jacob's life? And in particular, the thing that really stands out, or I hope it does stand out in living color, is that Jacob and his mother and Isaac were bent on following the counsel of God, and that is always to make sure that we only marry fellow believers. Does this always happen? No. We know some people, don't we? Some of us might have children that have made that decision. They were brought up in the faith. They're still in the faith. But then we make the decision that we're going to marry an unbeliever. Some of us know people that have made that decision to marry an unbeliever, and they're not in the faith today. And sometimes, well, more often than not, I would say well over 50% of the time, the spiritual fatality rate of the believer is very, very high. And so here we have a living example. Now, there's a stark contrast between Jacob and his brother Esau, because Esau had made the mistake of already taking 2 wives from the daughters of Heth. These were worshippers of idols. These were not worshippers of the true God of heaven. And Esau's life and his character kind of took a downward spiral, didn't it? And certainly part of that would be the fact that he had made that bad decision. And so God gives us this counsel: marry somebody that carries the same belief and faith in the true God of heaven, that follows Christ with all their heart, sincerely. Now, sometimes it's hard to be able to see through the fog of being in love, and falling into a relationship too far with somebody. And that brings up another question that's important, I think, for us to be able to consider as well, is that if we're unmarried and we're considering marriage in the future, we should never walk down a relationship with somebody of the opposite sex until we're convinced first that that person has a sincere relationship with Christ, that person is already committed to the values that we have. And again, sometimes we make that mistake. We walk down that road too far, and then we find ourselves with all those wonderful emotions and hormones that are running and so on. And now it's a lot harder to be able to see through all that fog and make a good decision. And so then we start to justify it. We say, well, it was fate, that brought me to this relationship with this person. And, well, was it fate? It wasn't divine fate, was it? Because God has made it very clear that we shouldn't marry an unbeliever. And yet we find that so often we do. So in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and verses 14 to 18, God has made it very clear in his word, where he says that as believers, we should not be unequally yoked with those who do not believe and follow Christ. And then he gives some reasons. He says, for what things do they have in common? What does evil have in common with what is righteous? Well, we can meet some pretty nice unbelievers, can't we? And if we meet a really nice unbeliever, it's harder to see through the counsel, or to be able to see clearly the counsel God gives to us. But even a nice unbeliever is still an unbeliever, isn't he? Or she. And so it doesn't matter how nice they are, they still don't hold the same values. They don't hold the same commitment to Christ as you do. And so it's still not the pathway that we should choose. Now, for Seventh-day Adventists, as young single Seventh-day Adventists, sometimes we fall in love with an unbeliever out of convenience. And again, I'm saying this just by observation as I've looked over the years. And we meet somebody at a local social, maybe at work, maybe at the gym or whatever it is. And so you start a relationship out of convenience. You know, they fell into your life in whatever way. And so we start to look at that as fate in a different way. Is that how Jacob saw it? Is that how Isaac saw it? Is that how Rachel saw it? Not Rachel, but I mean Rebecca. Yeah. No, they didn't see it that way at all. Okay? Did they say, well, hey, listen, you know, there's got to be a nice girl somewhere in the neighborhood. We'll just wait until she falls into your life. What happened? Now I'm testing you to see if you've ever read this chapter yet.
Well, he had two big goals.
Pardon me?
They sent him off to his family's people.
Okay, so they sent them off to their own people that worship the true God of heaven. Yeah. Was it convenient?
No.
Okay. Okay, if you're going to walk for 3 weeks by foot, 450 miles, that's not convenient, is it? Okay, so I think that there's a real application for us here today, and that is the fact that, you know, finding a believer and finding somebody that's appropriate within God's will for you to be able to marry doesn't mean that they live in the same city as you do. They might not even live in the same state. They might not even live in the same country. You know, Jacob left his country, you know, the land of Canaan. He went back up to the north, you know, Syria and so on, and back to his homeland of Haran. And so his family was involved with this as well. And so we have a believing family. And so we have mom, we have dad, we have the son, and they're all planning together and saying, hey, listen, we don't want to go down a road that God doesn't want us to go down. We already have seen some of the consequences of that take place with your other brother, with our other son, Esau. And so we want to make sure that you do things right, just like Isaac's dad did as well. And so Sarah and Abraham, of course, insisted that Isaac does not take a wife from the local idolatrous population, but rather was to find his wife back with their believing people. And so we have this repeated again in this chapter, don't we? And so this is a living example that, and did he find a believing wife? Well, he found 2 believing wives, did he? Okay, and that's a whole other story and question. But so here we have Jacob, and he's looking for a believing wife, and he's willing to go, his family is willing to support him, that he might go out of his way to be able to find the right wife. And so it wasn't a matter of convenience. Now, was it fate? Did the Lord lead Rachel to the well that day? Well, it doesn't say explicitly here, but I would venture to suggest that it's almost for certain that it wasn't by coincidence that Rachel, the moment that Jacob was inquiring about his uncle Laban, you know, the local shepherd said, oh, by the way, in fact, that's one of his daughters coming down the road right now with her flock. So the chances are that God had faithfully put her in the right place at the right time. And he had faithfully found Haran and was connected with the right people that connected him with the family. And of course, we have that beautiful picture beforehand where Isaac's wife was found. And of course, there was the prayer of Abraham's servant that was looking for her and said, you know, whoever, you know, serves the water and such at the well is the one that is meant to be and such. And so was that fate? Sounds like fate to me, but was it providential fate? Yes. So there's a difference between just fate of convenience, and I will get to your question, and fate of providence. And I think that's where we really want to be able to pick that up, is this is a fate of providence. Now, there's a key difference between fate of convenience and fate of providence that we find played out here. Number one, there's a sincere commitment firsthand that you will not go down the road of a relationship, a potential marriage relationship, with someone who is not already a committed believer. Okay, once you're in that place, God can start to work the providential part in his part, which is to start to look at the circumstances and put the right people in the right place at the right time. Second thing that also comes up in this is that Jacob had to go out of his way to find her. Okay, so he didn't find her down the street. He didn't find her at the next city down the road. He had to go 450 miles by foot to be able to find her. Was it still fate? Sure it was. But is there a proactive part on the place of Jacob and his family? Yes, there was, wasn't there? Okay, so I think it's very important for us to be able to pick that up. Above all things that we look at here is that fate, providential fate, is real, but it has to have those two key ingredients. It has to have those two key ingredients. First of all, you're already sincerely committed to be able to follow his will, no matter what. No matter how good-looking the guy next door might be, or the woman at work. If she isn't already committed to Christ, you have to be committed to saying, I don't care I don't care how attractive that person is to me. I'm not going to go down that road because God told me that I shouldn't. And then second of all, being proactive. Yes, we have a young man in the back who has a question.
So what if God puts you with an unbeliever or somebody in a different faith in order for them to be converted?
Okay, good. All right, and what's your name again? Tim. Okay, so Tim is asking, what if we come across an unbeliever that's not converted but can be converted through us? And that's a really good question because friendship evangelism is very real. Jesus befriended all kinds of unbelievers. In fact, that's, quite often he was criticized for that. He says he's a wine bibber and a drunken and a glutton and so on because he would eat and accept invitations to parties of sinners. And such. And so he would befriend them. He would have a sincere interest in their well-being and in their lives, and then he would bid them, follow me. Okay, so friendship evangelism is a very real. And so that's a very real dynamic that even Jesus himself had taught. One of the biggest wrong justifications that we can have as young people, as young believers and such, is that this good-looking person that I'm attracted to next door at work or wherever it is that's not a present believer will surely become a believer if I give my heart to them in a romantic and intimate and a courtship kind of setting. And so if I become their boyfriend or if I become their girlfriend and we start to hang out, we hold hands and we go on dates and so on, I'll be able to lead that person to the Lord. And more often than not, by far, the end of the story is not good. By far. I think the problem that we have as young people is that we look at the church and we look around and we see the success stories. Okay, so because the success stories are coming to church. The one that did marry an unbeliever, that person eventually came to find that the Lord was true, gave their heart to the Lord, they became converted. The problem is that they only represent, I would venture, probably 10% of every example where that takes place. All the rest of the fatalities aren't seen in church. Why? Because they aren't worshiping the Lord anymore. And so the other person, the unbeliever, more often than not, by far, is the one that ends up influencing the believer. And so make sure that you only give your heart to a believer before you go down that road any other way. Okay. And Jacob was found searching in all the right places. Are you going to find a good believing wife or husband if you go to the local bar or club? Okay, what are the chances? Chances are pretty low, isn't it? Okay. All right, so you want to make sure that you're searching in all the right places, and Jacob was going to the right places when he was searching as well, and so that's also important for us to understand. Wow, well, that's only verse 1. Okay, verse 2, he says, and he looked at the well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they water the flocks. A large stone was on the well's mouth. And so this is a little bit different of a well than that we find with Rebekah and Abraham's servant that had found her there, where it was kind of an open well where he had to draw the water out. This appears to have the water near the surface, and there's a large stone on the well's mouth, maybe protecting the purity of it or evaporating more than necessary. I'm not sure.
Well, it sounds like it's under pressure. That's what it sounds like.
Okay, I've never thought of that. Yeah.
The rock keeps the water down.
All right. So the suggestion is that perhaps there was some pressure of the well, and it was more of a spring type well. And when you pulled the water off, when you pulled the rock off, you didn't have to draw it. It just kind of bubbled out. And I never thought of that. That's a possibility. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. And Jacob said to them, "My brethren, where are you from?" And they said, "We are from Haran." So obviously Jacob's not arrived in Haran, but he's in the vicinity. He's definitely a lot closer than 400 miles now. And then he said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said to them, "We do know him." Now that indicates something very important. That is, Haran was not a very big city. Okay, so it was called a city, but like most ancient cities, they didn't have the high rises and everything that we have, and the capability to hold high populations. And so usually it was just several hundred that would live in a city. And in this case, you have a small city, and sure enough, they knew Laban. So he said to them, "Is he well?" And they said, "He is well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep." And so lo and behold, here we have Jacob, the servant of the Lord, prophet of the Lord, just received a vision on the way up, and now we find that God's providence, almost for certain, has led Rachel to the well at the exact same time. Then he said, "Look, it is still high day," or early in the day, as some translations might say. "It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them." But they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and then we water the sheep." So they're saying, hey, that's not how it works here. We kind of make sure we're all together, and then and again, maybe the spring thing is right. We want to make sure when we pull that well off, that top off, that when the water starts to come out, everybody's sheep gets a go at it. Verse 9, it says, "While they were still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess." And so Rachel's unique in the fact that she's out there working the sheep. She knows how to take care of her sheep. She's out there feeding it, protecting them, and so on.
That's a feat for a woman. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because you got to protect those sheep.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So here we have Rachel, and she's no slouch, is she? She's physically... for certain, she has some strength to her, some physical strength. She's definitely not fair, and so she's got a good tan, I'm sure, because she spends almost all day, every day outside, and she is working her dad's sheep. Also, it teaches us, as we learn later, because Laban, it turns out, is not what you would call a poverty-stricken family. He's at minimum upper class, maybe even more than that. He's got servants and maids and so on, and such. And yet, so Rachel didn't have to work to be able to feed the family, but she was raised to know that it's important to contribute and work for the family's needs. Verse 10, it says, "And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother." And so here we have Jacob, and he lays eyes on this young woman by the name of Rachel. Later on, she says she was beautiful in appearance and in form and so on. So she had everything going for her on the outside. And Jacob, being a single man that's looking for a wife, he noticed that very quickly, didn't he? And how often as men, all of a sudden, he's the one. He says, no, I'll roll the stone. Maybe some of the other shepherds were saying, well, we're all here now, maybe I should roll. No, I'll do it. So he goes up there and flexes his muscles and pushes the stone aside. I'm not sure, but, so Jacob is excited, nevertheless, and he's starry-eyed. Verse 11, "Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept." He cried. So he's got tears of joy. He's been traveling for 3 weeks. He's put on a lot of miles. He's seen a lot of people, but he hasn't recognized any of them. And of course, he doesn't know Rachel. He's never seen her in his life, but she's a cousin. She's family, and so on. And so obviously he's relieved. There's great expression, emotional expression of relief as Jacob kisses Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Now, of course, he didn't kiss her in any kind of romantic way, probably, on both cheeks and and so on, as the custom would be back then when you met somebody that you were related to or you knew or renewing with in a reunion and such, and so you're seeing an old friend or acquaintance and such, and so you would kiss them. In this case, he also wept with joy. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. And so she ran and told his father. And so I think we can rightly blend verse 11 and 12 together. I doubt that Jacob kind of approached Rachel and kind of, kissed and started crying, and she's saying, who is this weirdo that just kind of approached me and, in a strange and inappropriate way? I've never met him in my life. No, he probably had identified himself, and so verse 12 is kind of blending that. In fact, the Hebrew experts and scholars tell us that we can just as justly interpret verse 12 and say that Jacob had told Rachel that he was her father's relative and that he was Rebekah's son. And so she goes and runs and tells her father. And so there's some excitement now within the family, and she's going to run and tell her father. And then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And so he told Laban all these things. Now, I think it's helpful for us to kind of bring our mind back to Genesis 24, just a few chapters back, when we find that Abraham's servant was in the same city looking for a wife for Isaac. And Rebekah runs back, or at least brings the servant back, and tells not only her dad Bethuel about this particular encounter and this visit from the servant of Abraham, but also to tell him that where was I going with that again? I think I just lost my...
You're probably thinking about the similarity between Isaac finding his wife and Jacob finding his wife.
Right.
And the same family.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, so we have Rebekah and so on. And Laban was one of the first ones to be able to hear the news. And so it wasn't just Rebekah's father, Bethuel, but it was also Laban, her brother. And so Laban played a key part in that first encounter. And so this is really round two, isn't it? Because the first generation came up, Abraham's son Isaac needed a wife, so they went up and they found Rebekah, who was the sister of Laban. And so we find there in chapter 24 and verse 55. In fact, let's back up there quickly. Chapter 24 and verse 55, because it's a beautiful scene there that we find and that we've studied already in past Tuesdays, and that is that there was some very close bonds between the family, Rebekah and her brother, and her parents. So once Rebekah had agreed to go with Abraham's servant and return back to this long, far away foreign land to be able to marry Isaac, believing that indeed God had providentially arranged this, we find here that they want to linger. They want to not send her off right away. So verse 55 says, but her brother and her mother said, let saying, hey, listen, can you stick around for at least 10 days? Give us a few days to be able to just kind of linger and absorb our last moments, because they knew that there was a good chance that they wouldn't see Rebekah again in their lifetime. And that ended up being true, wasn't it? They never saw Rebekah again after that. And so Rebekah remained for the rest of her life down there, and so they remained 450 miles apart for the rest of their life. But we find here there's evidence there that Laban had a very close relationship with his sister. Rebekah was someone that he adored, someone that he really loved. And because it says not only mom said that, well, of course mom's going to say, can she linger a few more days before you take her away? But it also says that Laban, he finds out that his sister has a son and that his son has come up. Now, again, the numbers in history is a little bit interesting. This is 97 years later. There's 97 years between the first time that Abraham's clan showed up for a wife for Isaac and the time that Jacob shows up looking for a wife. So Laban said goodbye to his sister 97 years previous. Now his son shows up, and it came to pass when Laban heard the report, we already read that, and verse 14, and Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh, and he stayed with him for a month. Now, the following verse tells us that he didn't just hang out and kind of drink lemonade and such. I'm sure he had some great visits and catching up to do with him over some lemonade, but that's not all he did. He was obviously working on the estate, working on the farm, the fields. They had flocks. There was a lot of work to do, and so Jacob rolled up his sleeves and he participated. He contributed. In verse 15, it says, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? And so he's saying, listen, it's been a month now. You've been contributing and so on. You're my relative. It's probably fair that we start to pay you. Verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Now, keep in mind, up until this point, Jacob really didn't have a dollar to his name. He's just basically working for room and board, trying to be a good help around the house while he's staying with his uncle. And so he's already quite enamored with Rachel, and he's quite convinced that she's the one. My mom and dad sent me up here to find a wife, a believing wife. I agreed. I went up, and now I find this woman by the name of Rachel, and so he's quite in love, and so he takes advantage of the situation. He knows he can't offer a dowry because that was the custom back then. If you wanted to marry someone, you would have to approach the father and not only ask permission, which never happens today. I shouldn't say never, except in the most ideal and best situations, which I think is still something that I recommend highly. But not only would they ask the father for permission, but they would have a dowry to contribute as well. And so they would prove that they're worth something for their daughter as well. And I think there was some wisdom behind that kind of practice as far as the custom goes, and we've kind of lost that. And so basically that's kind of proving in a large way, in most circumstances, that would prove in a large way that, hey, I'm grown up, I'm a man now, I'm not a boy. I've got a job, I'm responsible with my money, I've been collecting and saving this amount of money and so on. And so myself and perhaps my family and such are showing that we can provide for her, and that I have something to give her besides just my good looks, or my charming personality. I have something that I can give her that will last through the years that are to come. Yes, somebody had a question over here.
I got one, but I think
Yeah.
it's the other way around. The dowry goes with the girl. The girl's father gives the groom a dowry to, I don't know, I'm not sure how it started, but the groom gives a ring to demonstrate that he has the wealth.
Oh, you mean the other way around? So that the woman offers the dowry?
Well, the father would offer the dowry.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The bigger the dowry, then the better the prospects for a husband who can provide for his daughter.
Okay.
But that wasn't
I don't-
the
I-
way it was with Isaac and Rebekah, because Isaac, the servant went and he
Right.
took the goods to them,
Right, right.
the dowry.
Okay. So Chris is saying that in that culture, apparently was the other way around. Now, maybe some of the cultures today or in recent history and so on have it that way. Now, of course, it depends on what culture, what country, and what era, and so on and so forth. But Chris is just pointing out that when Isaac was, when Rebekah was being offered the marriage hand of Isaac, that Abraham and his family had sent, the nose rings and the jewelry and the different dowry and such.
He wanted to demonstrate that he was a man of substance and who
Right.
he really could provide for the girl.
Right.
I'm not so sure that that's really, but it's a moot point.
Okay.
But there's a point though that we're missing. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like Rachel had the upper hand on the beautiful in appearance.
Right. So Terry is pointing out that Rachel had everything going on the outside.
That
Yeah. And that does become quite apparent, doesn't it? So verse 16, now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, or some translation will say weak or fragile, and so on. But Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. So that but in between, Leah's eyes were delicate. This is her kind of physical appearance and what she could offer physically. But Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. And so you have this contrast in that one verse alone. And so Leah didn't have as much to offer physically. But she certainly had something to offer as you read the rest of her experience and so on. Besides children, just a devotion to God and so on. And it wasn't her that brought the idols, that stole the idols when they later left their father's house, but it was Rachel, wasn't it? That was kind of stashing the idols underneath her and saying, it's that time of month, I'm sorry, I can't get off my horse. We have a gentleman in the back, and then Ken.
First of all, they did have something like a dowry given kind of to the man.
Yeah.
The custom was the dowry would be given to the father, but then he would give the dowry to his daughter
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Afterwards.
Yes.
He wasn't actually required to do that, but that was what he would do.
Right.
Now, Laban selfishly withheld that.
Mm-hmm.
And then Rachel and Leah said, well, he's kind of like sold us for the money he could get
Right.
from the dowry. But Rachel took matters into her own hands. She took the idols. Now, she didn't take them for worship. The idols were believed to be belonging to the land.
Mm-hmm.
And when you took the idols, it was like claiming possession of the land as their dowry from
Yeah.
Jacob.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yes, that's all. I agree 100%. Thank you for that insight. Yes.
Expensive, right? Those idols are expensive, probably made of solid silver or gold.
I don't know. Some were wood, some were stone, some were gold, some were silver. You're right. Yes. Ken.
Do we know how old Jacob was at this point?
He was around 77, 80 years old. Yeah. Yeah. Now, of course, he's about our equivalent of 40 today because he's middle-aged, right? His dad lived to 160. So when you're 80, you were just about being 40 today. Yeah. 40, 45 years old. Yeah. That's right. Right. Yeah. So he's just barely middle-aged.
It doesn't seem like he has any boys. No? They even had the girls. His daughter's a shepherdess. Otherwise she wouldn't need to
Okay.
be a shepherdess, right?
Yeah.
He only had girls, firstborn being Leah and Rachel being second.
Right, yeah. So it's mentioned that perhaps Laban didn't have any boys, and that's why Rachel was working the shepherd position there as well, and such. Yeah, all good points. Verse 18, now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And so that was his kind of version of a dowry, is that, I don't have any, money to my name, but I'm willing to work off that dowry. I'm willing to contribute to the wealth of the estate of your family, including Rachel, until the 7 years is complete, and then I will have her hand in marriage. And Laban said, it is better that I should give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Laban obviously agrees. Now, how excited Rachel was about this, we don't know. It doesn't really say, does it? Yeah, interesting culture, isn't it? The customs and the culture is so different compared to us here in our modern day and age, because to kind of barter, he's kind of, it sounds like he's bartering in a way, doesn't it? And so, I'll pay off, your daughter and such over the next 7 years. But he's willing to work hard. And so he did. And Laban said it is better. And so in verse 20, so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love that he had for her. And so did he sincerely love her? Yeah, you have to sincerely love somebody to put up with that, to work hard for 7 years. He's not getting any salary. It's just room and board until he gets, at least all of it, it points to that, until he has his new bride in hand. And so it says it only seemed like a few days to him. Now, if he didn't truly love her, it would seem like a whole lot more than 7 years, wouldn't it? But in this case, it says that the days went by fast because he was in eyesight and got to eat at the same table as Rachel.
John, that's 84 months of wages.
Yeah. 84 months of wages, yeah. So this is more than a few $1,000s in our modern equivalent, isn't it? Okay, we're talking, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. Okay, then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled that I may go into her." And so there's a couple of interesting things there. First off, he has to kind of remind Laban. Laban doesn't come up to him and say, "Okay, good job, son." He has to kind of remind him. Laban's not as interested in keeping track of the time as Jacob is, and that would be natural as well. That I may go into her. Now, boy, if you talk to a potential father-in-law today like that, boy, you might not stay in the room very long. You might have a bloody nose or something. But back then they were a lot freer and obviously a lot more comfortable about the consummation of the wedding as well.
Was he blinded at this time?
Who's this?
Jacob.
Well, he's blinded with love, that's for sure.
I know, but he's got the wrong one.
What's that? Oh, I see. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. You know the story. We haven't even read those verses, Terry.
Oh, all right.
Okay, verse 22. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. And of course, this represents a wedding, doesn't it? Okay, he made a feast. He gathered all the men together in one place, and he had a wedding feast. Now, back in ancient times, a wedding feast typically lasted about a week. And so we have Samson. When he got married, it says that the feast actually took a week before it was all said and done. And that's why he was saying, before the end of the 7 days of the if you can solve this riddle, the honey and the lion, then before the 7 days of the feast of the wedding is complete. Verse 23, now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and went and brought her to Jacob. And he went into her. When did he bring to him? In the night. Okay, now that doesn't happen today, does it? Okay, we have weddings taking place all the time. And when do we have our weddings?
Somewhere between 1 and 3.
When is the bride brought before the groom? Yeah, somewhere between 1 and 3. That's right, yeah, in the bright afternoon. But in this case, the custom was that the bride wasn't brought to the groom. He didn't lay eyes on her and such until evening.
Dark tent.
Okay, in a dark tent. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. Again, a sign that this was a pretty well-off family. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? Why was it not Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? And so, of course, the million-dollar question that always comes up, and we were all thinking about it even here this evening, is, how did Jacob not know that it was Leah? And I don't know the answer to that for certain, but there is some evidence. Yes.
In those days, they used to wear veils when they got married.
Okay.
So
Yes.
we don't really know.
Yes.
That's what I was thinking. I think those days they wore veils, didn't they?
I think, and even, they don't today so much, but my wife wore a veil. You can kind of see through it a little bit. But even today, we have a little bit of the remnant of that custom where a veil is placed over the bride and so on. But in this case, she's brought to him in the evening after the sun is set. It's dark, and if she's wearing any kind of veil, and it's dark, it's more dark than it is light. They've kind of entered into the consummation, and their honeymoon begins and so on. But it's perhaps it was how it happened, but the Bible doesn't give us every detail.
Yeah, I think probably what happened was during the wedding feast, Jacob had more than just a little wine.
Okay, so Mike is suggesting maybe he had more than a little wine, and
I would say
yeah.
they didn't have any PG&E in those days either.
No PG&E. Okay, no electricity. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the custom could be that they didn't even light the candles. That the father would bring the bride, and the consummation would take place as part of the feast and the ceremony that took place that night. One thing that we do know is that Jacob didn't know, did he? Was he sincerely deceived? Okay, he was sincerely deceived, and so he woke up the next morning and looked over, and now the sun was risen, and he said, "Wait a minute, you're not Rachel, you're Leah." And was he mad? Sure, he was infuriated, and so he goes to his new father-in-law and says, "What have you done to me? You have deceived me." And of course, we're not ones that believe in karma, but something came back, didn't it? Something. He got a taste of his own medicine. Now he got a little bit of a feel of how Esau and his dad felt, when he had done the same thing to them. And What goes around comes around. There is a bit of a real reality to that, and the Proverbs give us some indication of that as well. Okay, so, and it came to pass in the evening, where are we here? Oh, you deceived me. Verse 26, and Laban said, it must not be done in our own country to give the younger before the firstborn. Now, whether or not that's true, we don't know, but one thing that we do know is that Laban is knowing that it was important for him to be able to hook up Leah with this very not only hardworking but very prosperous. Obviously everything he touched kind of turned to gold, like type thing, just like his father and his grandfather. Yes.
Yeah, this is what confuses me about these days. Today, no, you don't do that. When did it become okay to just marry as many times as you want, or you only marry once, like today?
Are you talking about marrying more than one person at the same time?
The solution was just give me another 7 years, you can have the other daughter.
Okay, Terry, you're getting ahead of us again. We haven't read those verses.
Well, he's just asking.
I know.
Okay, to have
Yeah.
more than one.
No, it's not. Terry, it's not okay to have more than one wife.
I know, but the history of the Bible up to this point is it was nothing to really worry about having more than one wife.
I can't speak for that. The Bible doesn't say what was going through the mind of Jacob or Isaac. And, Isaac only married one, but Jacob obviously married two. And we do know that by the time Moses came along, about 450 years later, that God had made it very clear in the scriptures from that point on, in the law of Israel, that it was forbidden for a man to marry two sisters. So you weren't to take wives from the same family, from two sisters. And such. Pardon me?
What about all of Solomon's wives?
Yeah, but they weren't sisters. Yeah.
I said, what about all those wives?
What about them?
I didn't care about
What about them?
Well, yeah. What about that?
You're asking if polygamy was okay, and it's not. And we covered that on a previous night, and I think it's very well. There's a lot of things that displease God, but He's willing to work with, and He'll work in spite of our errors at times. And this is certainly one of those times where He will. There's certain standards that He developed as time went on. Whether it's jewelry or whether it's polygamy and so on. Where by the time you get to the New Testament, very clearly it says that that you shall be the husband of one wife. So very clearly, then God drew that line very strongly from that point forward. That, and then in regards to jewelry, yes, they were wearing jewelry in different ways and fashions and so on. But in the New Testament, it says, dress modestly in sobriety, not with gold and pearls and expensive clothing and so on. So God kind of clarified some of these issues in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, I don't have all the answers to that. But one thing I think is important for us to understand is that, as Jesus said when He was asked about divorce, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And God said, no, absolutely not. If you go back to the beginning, it was not so. For a man was to leave his mother and father, and the two were to become one flesh. What God has put together, let no man pull apart. Okay? And so very clearly, He brought us to the beginning. So if we want to know if polygamy was part of God's original plan, all we have to do is do the same thing Jesus did. Go back to the beginning. If we go back to the beginning, we find there that we have one husband and one wife. Okay, there's just Eden, or Eve, I should say. Okay, there wasn't a Sally and a Josie and okay, it was just Eve. So Eve. So if we go back to the beginning, like Jesus says, He gives us the original plan and what His original purpose and design was for us, and that is to have one wife and to have one husband. And so, was it a sin? Yeah, it was wrong. And polygamy was never acceptable in God's eyes. He never looked at it sometimes and said, you know what, we're okay with it today. No, but He was working with it. I don't have all the answers to how and why He was working in those different ways, but one thing that we do want to make sure that we understand clearly is that it was never right. It was never appropriate. Yeah. Sorry, Pastor Doug, you had a question or a comment. Okay.
I do.
Okay.
What God institutes is to make us happy. Anything that He has instituted is for our happiness.
Okay.
It's when man makes his own decisions and starts doing things on his own
Right.
that brings the suffering onto himself.
That's right. Yes.
So the experience that we see in the Bible
Yes.
with them doing that thing,
Right.
it's the same experiences that are going on today.
Right. Right.
And you can lump it all in as sin, but it's not that God forbid it. He did forbid marrying outside of your family, or, from the pagans, but he allows it, but we suffer the consequences of it.
Right. Did he allow a king in Israel?
Sure he did.
Was he happy about it?
No.
Did he know that it would bring happiness, or would it bring more grief?
It's going to bring more grief.
More grief, that's right. And same with polygamy and some of these other things. Yes, Pastor Ross.
Also, I think we need to bear in mind that the culture was a little different in those days. If a woman lost her husband, she became a widow, and she didn't have children, she would have to go back to her father's house,
Right.
or she would have to seek to be married.
Mhm.
And so in the plan that God gave to Moses, there was provisions made that if a woman lost her husband,
Mhm.
and she didn't have an heir, her husband's brother was to marry her
Right.
and take her in, so that there could be an heir.
Right.
So, like Jesus said, it was the hardness of your hearts that God allowed these things to happen, but it was never his original plan.
Right.
Nevertheless, God understood and helped in certain situations.
Excuse me.
And yeah, it was abused by many. It was never God's will that there be multiple wives, but there were instances where God actually directed that the brother was to take another wife in order for her
Right.
well-being.
But not at the same time, of course, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes.
Also, wasn't Laban in that society idol worshiping society? So they may not have been in tune with God's laws.
Right.
Well, yeah, Laban showed himself to be a shyster all the way through. I mean, greed was a very large weakness in his heart and in his life and his character. And so that comes out as time goes along, the chapters go by.
The idol worshiping
Yeah.
religion may have been multiple wives, so that maybe he may have been consistent with.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And
Mhm.
or wherever it was,
Mhm.
but he and not really in tune with God's law.
Right. Good point. Thank you, Mike. Okay, so where are we?
31.
Oh, are we going to make it through? Where are we? How many more verses do we have? Okay, let's see if we can make it through here. Why have you deceived me? And Laban said, it must not be done in our country. Fulfill her 1 week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you serve with me still another 7 years. So he says, let's just finish the week here. That week was probably the week of the marriage feast. And so the marriage feast would continue on. He said, let's just finish the ceremonies. Let's just keep this undercover. And then at the end of the week, I'll also give you Rachel, and you and Rachel and Leah can set up your household and live happily ever after. Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and so he gave him as his daughter Rachel as wife also. And then Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. And then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served Laban still another 7 years. Then when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Reuben. What does Reuben mean? Okay, see, a son. For she said, the Lord has surely looked upon my affliction. Now, therefore, my husband will love me. And so she's, of course, have this hope that this will win the affections and the eye of Jacob. And then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard me that I am loved, he has also therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name shall be Levi, which means attached. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, which means praise. And then she stopped bearing. And so the very first 4 sons of Jacob came not from the woman that he loved so much, that he adored, but rather the one that he was also bound to through his father-in-law's deception. And so God here is looking out for Leah. And that doesn't mean that God promised her a rose garden. Sometimes we look at God and we shake our fist at him too quickly because things aren't going right and we're going through struggles and life's not fair at times and such. Certainly life was not easy for Leah on a lot of different fronts, but God is still looking out, isn't he? And he's saying, listen, life is not going to be easy. It really isn't for any of us as long as the sin problem is still here. But I'm still going to make sure that I give you enough resources and enough reason to live and find purpose in life, and that you'll find yourself to the end. And then when I come through my Son and the resurrection takes place and you receive your new body, then life will really begin. And don't you look forward to that time? And I look forward to that time as well. And so I hope that we were able to pull away some of these different truths and apply it to our own lives. And so in regards to where we find our spouse, how many spouses we find, and indeed that God's plan is always perfect, and He always knows what is best. He takes no good thing away from us, as it says in the Psalms.